dealing with continued British opposition, but for many years he had nurtured deep misgivings about war with the United Kingdom. To Hitler, the defeat of Britain would only serve to hand her empire to the United States and Japan. Now, with the British powerless to intervene on the continent, they would surely come to some kind of arrangement. Anything else, Hitler believed, would be simply irrational. Increasingly impatient, Hitler waited for news that Britain was willing to make peace. But compromise never came. On July the 2nd, he finally ordered his generals to prepare preliminary plans for an invasion. And on the 16th, he ordered the plan put into effect. The operation, codenamed Sea Lion, was to be ready by mid-August. Yet even at this stage, Hitler was hoping that the threat of invasion itself would be enough to force the British to negotiate. Above all others, it was Winston Churchill who was the driving force behind Britain's refusal to come to terms with Adolf Hitler. Appointed Prime Minister on the very day that Germany invaded Western Europe, Churchill had been a compromise candidate for the leadership, and his authority was far from complete. Many of his senior colleagues believed that his hardline rejection of Hitler's peace overtures was suicidally obstinate. Churchill had no such doubts. For many years, he had warned of the threat posed by Nazi Germany, and now he announced that Britain would fight. Churchill understood that any German invasion attempt would depend on the Luftwaffe winning mastery of the air, and that only the RAF's fighters could prevent them doing so. To increase Britain's fighter strength, Churchill created a new government department, the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and put at its head an energetic and talented newspaper tycoon, Lord Beaverbrook. Through Beaverbrook, Churchill could ensure that even while his air marshals demanded bombers, fighter production was given the highest priority. As the great test of the Battle of Britain drew closer, Churchill, in spite of his stirring oratory, had yet to gain the complete confidence of the British people. What sustained him in this, the greatest crisis in Britain's history, was his own unshakable belief that victory would come.
To resistance and revolt, and if driven to desperate hazards, he attempts the invasion of the British Isles, as well he may. We shall not flinch from the supreme trial. Lift up your hearts. All will come right. Out of the depths of sorrow and of sacrifice will be born again the glory of mankind.
In overall command of Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, was Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the man who had overseen the decisive flanking drive through the Ardennes, which had won the Battle of France. The invasion plan called for 2 army groups, altogether over 250,000 men, to land on the shores of Britain. Von Rundstedt's Army Group A, made up of the 16th and 9th Armies, with 10 divisions and 650 tanks, was to embark in harbours between the estuaries of the Scheldt and the Seine. Protected at sea by U-boats and minefields, they would land on a strip of the English coast between Folkestone and Brighton. Part of the 9th Army would also land in the Isle of Wight, Portsmouth area. At the same time, parachutists would be dropped to cover the flanks of the invasion beaches. To the west, a secondary landing was to be mounted by the 6th Army of Army Group B. Sailing from Cherbourg with 3 divisions in its first wave, 6th Army, its flanks also covered by parachutists, was to land in Lyme Bay and advance northward towards Bristol and the Severn Estuary. After a week consolidating their beachheads, the invaders would push forward to take the high ground along an arc from the Thames Estuary to Portsmouth. In a second phase, London was to be cut off from the west and encircled, and the whole of southern England occupied up to a line running from the Severn to Malden in Essex. The sheer quantity of shipping required for Operation Sea Lion, 155 transports and 3,000 smaller craft for the first wave alone, meant that Hitler's orders to be ready to invade in mid-August were impossibly ambitious. The Navy protested that assembling the ships would take until at least the middle of September, nor could it guarantee to protect the invasion flotilla from Britain's powerful home fleet. To the Army's dismay, the Navy was insisting that the landings be restricted to a narrower and much more easily defended front. On only one subject were the German Army and Navy in full agreement. No invasion could succeed unless the Luftwaffe won complete control over the skies of southern England and the English Channel. The prospect of the invasion fleet being bombed and strafed as it crept towards England was a nightmare, and only German air power could prevent interference by the Royal Navy. Operation Sea Lion therefore depended totally on the destruction of Britain's air force. The Luftwaffe, flushed with its recent victories in Europe, was supremely confident that it could achieve that objective. The first phase in the German air offensive was to be a series of bombing attacks on British merchant ships in the Channel, mounted from airfields in France and Belgium. Britain was to be faced with a major dilemma: send fighters to defend the convoys and have them shot down by German fighter escorts, or lose the ships. After the preliminary stage of gradually wearing down British fighter strength, the full-scale assault would begin. The Eagle Offensive would involve massive raids on RAF fighter fields and sector stations. Aircraft factories would also be hit. Within 4 days of the launch of the offensive, the Royal Air Force would have to abandon its southern airfields for sanctuary further north. Another 4 weeks would annihilate the remnants of the RAF's fighter strength. The way would be open for invasion. If British air and sea power were unable to beat off a German invasion fleet, the nation's survival would depend on the British Army. After the evacuation from Dunkirk, the Army had only 786 field guns and 167 anti-tank guns. There were only 2 armoured divisions, one of them incomplete, and altogether Britain had little more than 200 tanks heavy enough to take on the German panzers. The army plan for defeating a German invasion depended heavily on infantry and on fixed defences. From Berwick-on-Tweed to Weymouth, coastal areas up to 20 miles deep were closed to the public, sown with mines and fenced off with barbed wire. Across Britain, a series of defensive stop lines